my long-standing friend and colleague, Dr. Vidhana Patrana, the distinguished participants at the head table, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be at the SLEA's annual sessions again. It's actually over a year. Time seems to pass very quickly. I seem to recall the last occasion as though it was just a few months ago. Before I get on to the theme of this year's sessions, I always say this. I say that whenever I get a captive audience, that I have no option but to say a little bit about what we're trying to do in terms of macroeconomic policy making at the central bank. Now, if you really want a very sophisticated and profound analysis of the recent economic developments as well as the plans the central bank has for 2019, I would encourage you to go to the central bank roadmap, which is available on the central bank website. The Economic Research Department puts that together with contributions from other departments, and that does a much better job than I can do. So, but what I am going to try to do this afternoon is to share with you some thoughts on some of the challenges that we are facing in terms of macroeconomic policy making in the country. Let me start. Is that available? I want to just show you 3 graphs which will, I hope, set out the landscape against which all economic policy making in the country has to be made. You know, Sri Lanka is a twin deficit country. Well, here are some of the reasons. One, you look at government revenue as a percent of GDP, it's up around 18, 19, even 20% in the 70s, 80s, even 90s. It's sort of 19%. The highest was about 22%, I think. Then you come to the trough in 2014, which is 11.5. So revenue as a percentage of GDP fell from, around 20% to 11.5%. So that is one deficit. Now, we have expenditure of about 20% of GDP. The sustainable deficit, in terms of the deficit that can be financed without there being a overly onerous debt dynamic, is about 3.5%. That kind of deficit we can finance without adding to our debt problem. So if you work backwards, the 20% of GDP expenditure we have is actually relatively okay. If you look at our comparator countries, that's roughly where we should be. Of course, there are questions about the quality of that expenditure and as to whether we can improve the quality, but the overall level is okay. So if 3.5% is a deficit we can finance sustainably, then we have to collect about 16.5, 17% of GDP as revenue. And we went down to 11.5. It's now crept up to closer to 14%. We have to get it up to 16. People complain about paying taxes in this country, but actually we are a relatively low-taxed economy. We used to collect much more tax in the past. Of course, a lot of that tax came from the tea, rubber, and coconut sectors. Those sectors no longer have a surplus to be taxed, but the new emerging sectors still enjoy a lot of tax holidays and various relief, and they are not paying their way as far as taxation is concerned. Now, we take great pride in our free education and free health, but we are very reluctant to pay for it. As I keep telling people, we have a taste for Scandinavian-style social welfare and Hong Kong rates of tax. So sadly, that doesn't add up. So that's one issue, right? So the one deficit is the fiscal deficit, and which is unsustainable, and a major part of the explanatory story is the fall in government revenue. Then the next graph is, you just have a look at what has happened to our debt stock. In 2005, only 3.9% of the debt stock was non-concessional. It went up to 7.3% in 2006, it is now 54.8%. Okay? So that is what has happened to the basically the structure of our debt stock. More than half is now non-concessional. If I can go to the next, while this was happening, while we were taking on more and more commercial debt, at the same time, look what's happened to our exports. This is goods only, but even if you add services, this is roughly the shape of the curve you get. 33% of GDP in 2000, down to a trough of 13.1% in 2015. So we took on a lot of commercial debt and allowed exports to fall. So that is the second deficit. The current account deficit, side by side with a much more adverse external debt dynamics. So that is really the landscape against which macroeconomic policy has been made. Of course, there's no problem in taking on commercial debt, but you can't then, commercial external debt, but you can't then put it into non-tradables or into projects that don't give you a high enough rate of return to earn or save enough foreign exchange. Now, you know we got all that wrong, and that's why we are in the mess that we're in. We're a twin deficit country with a very tough external debt dynamic. So that's the landscape, and that's the framework that limits our room to maneuver in terms of macroeconomic policy making. So let me next really, because it's still kind of hot off the press, I'll go through kind of each of the kind of macro policy issues one by one and just share some thoughts with you. First is the dialogue with the IMF. As you know, just earlier this week, the finance minister went to Washington to meet the managing director and the deputy managing director of the IMF. Now, one thing we need to say is that even without an IMF program, we have to do what are the two crucial objectives of the IMF program. One is revenue enhancement-based fiscal consolidation. You saw the graph there. The second is to build up our net international reserves to meet this tsunami of debt servicing that is coming up before us in the next 5 years. So IMF or no IMF, we need to do that. So why is it useful to have the IMF? IMF doesn't go around the world and impose itself on people. Countries go to the IMF when they've messed things up. There are only two countries in Asia with a program with the IMF. That is Sri Lanka and Mongolia. Pakistan is negotiating one, but these are the only two countries. And also, I read a lot of narrative about the IMF, which in my view is somewhat misinformed, because one, it is true the IMF works within a very rigid framework, but the IMF post Dominic Strauss-Kahn is a different IMF. Dominic Strauss-Kahn shifted the agenda of the IMF. It is less ideologically rigid. Yes, it has a framework, but it takes into account now social indicators, social expenditure, and it's a broader framework, and it is more flexible. But our mindset is stuck in the past when the IMF was a much more ideological. During the Reagan-Thatcher era, the IMF became extremely ideological. There was the famous Washington Consensus, which was then imposed on country after country around the world. The IMF now operates somewhat differently. I'm not saying that it is extremely flexible, but it is different. And we saw some of that when we went to Washington earlier this week. The minister went to Washington for two reasons. One is he wanted to signal very clearly to the senior management of the IMF that Sri Lanka wishes to continue its engagement with the IMF through the extended fund facility. Secondly, he wanted to signal to the senior management of the IMF that the staff level agreement that we reached on the 26th of October, which could not be announced because of the developments on that day, that we needed some deviation from that, because the facts on the ground had changed. That there were solid economic and political economy reasons why the agreement that was reached needed to be modified. And the main issue where the minister was looking for modification was when it came to the fiscal targets. He wanted more fiscal space because the growth performance of the economy, as you know, is well below par. So he wanted space for more growth-oriented policies. And he also wanted some fiscal space to strengthen the social safety net. There are a number of people who have qualified for Samruddhi, but who are not able to get on to Samruddhi. Of course, there are lots of people in Samruddhi who should not be on it, but the IMF is not insisting that we take those people off, but they're willing to consider us, including the people who deserve to be on it. So these are the two areas where the minister asked for flexibility. And in order to do that, he wanted some reduction in the primary surplus target that was agreed upon in October. The IMF agreed to be flexible, but how flexible, we do not know. So the government has a position, the IMF has a position. Where we end up will be the subject of negotiations when the IMF team comes to Colombo in mid-February. They're coming in mid-February because they want to make an assessment of the data as at the 31st of December. The October 26th agreement was based on June 30th data. Time has passed, the facts on the ground have changed. They want to look at the 31st December data, and the fiscal data for the year only becomes available in mid-February, which is when they're coming, and there'll be negotiations, and hopefully we can negotiate some flexibility on the fiscal side with the IMF. So that's where the IMF situation is. And you know, the importance of the IMF program, the amount of money, you know, it's 1.5 billion in 6 tranches. It's not really very much money, to be frank. But of course, the signaling effect is important. And one thing we need to do is when you get yourself into the kind of external debt, very challenging external debt dynamic that we have got ourselves into, we have to have the confidence of foreign holders of capital. We need to have, people need to have confidence to buy our bonds. People need to have confidence to invest in our country. Because this is something we forget. We tend to be too inward looking sometimes. And people, when you write off the IMF, if you say, okay, let's not have the IMF, you can be sure as night follows day that we will not be able to raise the money we need to pay back the external debt that we owe over the next 5 years. That is a fact, because we have such a debt, wall of debt that we have to repay, that unless we have that IMF seal of housekeeping, we are not going to be able to raise the money that we have to pay that debt. So, of course, that doesn't mean that we do everything that they say. We need to negotiate very rigorously and to make our case to have enough space for growth, to have enough space to make sure that our social safety net remains intact. But you know, when you become as indebted as we are to the rest of the world, you hand over a significant share of your economic sovereignty. That is the reality of the situation. So we need to absorb that, we need to understand that. I think this audience, more than anybody else, should be able to raise awareness in the country about the situation we're in. We can't do just what we want, simply because we need other people's money to pay our debt and to have sufficient space in terms of our balance of payments to import what we need for our essentials, as well as to support our growth and employment creation. Okay, next let me turn to, this I've been going on about our debt obligations and the challenge we have to meet it. So in the short term, we ran into, or have run into, a crunch, so to speak. Because on the 26th of October, as I said, we had the staff level agreement. In fact, We were on the phone from 6 p.m. to 7:20 p.m. on that evening, and we reached staff level agreement about 7:30. We were quite euphoric because the IMF was going to announce the staff level agreement on the following Monday. And 2 hours later, the IMF representative called me and asked me what's going on. She said, sorry, we can't announce it. So we lost that, we lost the agreement. And on the same day, the Ministry of Finance went to Parliament and got a resolution passed to raise up to 310 billion rupees purely for liability management. So armed with the staff level agreement and this resolution, the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank were going to go out and raise the money we needed. And unfortunately, what happened was there was a delay of 2 years, because clearly the potential lenders did not want to go ahead until there was clarity about the political situation in the country. So we lost 2 months. By losing 2 months, there is a lot of pressure that has come on, because in 2019, total external debt service payments is 5.9 billion USD. 2.6 billion of that is due in the first quarter of this year. So the delay of 2 months plus the front loading of foreign debt payments has created a real crunch. Fortunately, I think we are going to be able to see our way through it. And for that, we have to be very grateful to our friends. First off the mark was the Reserve Bank of India. They gave us a swap arrangement for 400 million rupees. That's under their SAC swap agreement. And they are now actively considering giving us a further $400 million and a further $1 billion as a bilateral swap agreement. And China, the Bank of China, which has an office in this country, when we asked them to come and we spoke to them, they immediately said, we can give you $300 million before the end of the month, and there's a possibility of upscaling it to $1 billion, a 3-year loan. But they said that will take longer, because while the approval structure meant that the 300 million could be given quickly, the 1 billion will take a bit longer. But the Bank of China has indicated that they will very favorably consider giving us a term loan of 3 years of $1 billion. In addition, and we're also talking to the People's Bank of China about a possible swap as well. So in addition to this term loan and from the Bank of China, there is another term loan. The China Development Bank gave us a term loan of $1 billion in the last quarter of 2018, and there is a provision to upscale that by another 500 million, and there is a pretty good chance that 500 million will also come in during the first quarter of this year. The other kind of source of external financing that is being actively explored is the state banks. The NSB is negotiating a credit line of $750 million US, and that money would be made available to the government. The Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank are also trying to increase their credit lines. So there's some more money that should come in. It's not finalized yet as to how much, but some more money will also come in through those sources. Now, we are scrambling desperately hard to get all this money together. And I should also say one other big thing, sorry. Tuesday before last, the Cabinet approved the issuance of international sovereign bonds to the tune of $2 billion US. So the idea is to have the most of it will be raised through a dollar-denominated international sovereign bond, and we will also explore raising a panda bond and a samurai bond. Now, we're scrambling hard to get all this done very quickly, because I think the job of central bankers is to prepare for the worst. And I think it was Mark Carney who said that's the main job of a central banker, is to prepare for the worst. He was talking in the context of Brexit. And I'm talking in the context of the totally unexpected, unforeseen situation that emerged on the 26th of October. So we don't know when something like that is going to hit us again. So before that happens, we want to go and raise all the money that we need to pay this year's debt. So that's what's happening on the external financing side. I should also say, I don't know whether we have fully taken cognizance of the very powerful new architecture we have, new element of architecture we have for liability management. And that was the passage of the Active Liability Management Act in, I think it was March or April of 2018. What that does is it enables us to borrow purely for the purposes of liability management. In the past, the borrowing limit was set in the Appropriation Act, and you could not borrow anything more than what was required for the government's cash flow requirement. What the Active Liability Management Act does is it enables you to borrow over and above the limit, the borrowing limit in the Appropriation Act, and that money is earmarked only for liability management. And that is extremely powerful because from now on, the maturity and cost structure of our debt is no longer fixed. Because, say now at the moment, there is a case for us to actually go rather slowly this year because interest rates may come down later in the year. But given the political risk, we feel we can't take that chance. But why we have now a higher tolerance level for borrowing at slightly tougher terms is that further down the line, if interest rates come down, we can go to the market, borrow some money, and use that to pay off the higher cost instruments that we have floated. So that gives us more flexibility and more headroom than in the past. Now, let me just quickly run through. One problem, of course, is the very subdued growth, running at about 3%. The central bank thinks the potential growth rate is about 5.75, so we are well below potential growth, big output gap. There may be, it's possible that the Census and Statistics Department is under-recording the growth because they've just had a methodological change. It's a good, sophisticated methodology, but they don't have all the resources they need to do the surveys that are necessary to support this new methodology. And some of the proxies they are being forced to use, in our view, may not be capturing some of the new economic activities. But even, at best, it's not going to be more than 3.7, 3.8%, which is well below potential. And of course, everybody keeps saying, why can't the central bank reduce interest rates and give a boost to the economy? Well, I must tell you that at every monetary policy review, both the internal monetary policy committee as well as the monetary board thinks very hard about doing that. And there is a case for reducing rates. One, there's an output gap. Two, inflation is well within our target band, and in fact, sometimes even lower than the lower bound of the target. Nominal and real interest rates are high. Then both monetary aggregates and credit growth are broadly where we want it to be, though there is some increase in private sector credit recently. So if you take all that together, you would say, why is it you can't reduce interest rates? And the problem there is, one, mainly the pressure there is on the currency and the reserve level. Fortunately, in the last day or two, things seem to be getting better, but while that pressure is on, we can't really, the room to maneuver is very limited. And the other important thing is signaling, because when you need to raise the kind of money that we have, if there is even some semblance of the central bank playing fast and loose with monetary policy, it will become much more difficult for us to raise the money that we want. At a time when the exchange rate is under pressure, if the central bank is seen to be reducing interest rates, though the domestic compulsions are compelling to reduce interest rates, we have this issue of having to raise this vast amount of money. So that's the balance that you have to strike. And hopefully when there is less pressure on the external front, then that will give more room to maneuver. Then on the exchange rate, I should have said in terms of the actual policy setting, the central bank signaled an end to its tightening bias, which existed from the beginning of 2015 till April of 2018, when the upper bound of the policy corridor was reduced by 25 basis points. And subsequently also, in November, the SRR was reduced by 90 basis points, because there was a shortage of liquidity, and there still is a shortage of liquidity in the money markets. But we neutralized that by increasing the interest rate corridor, because we didn't want to shift from a neutral bias at this moment. On the exchange rate, there was pressure that came on from about April initially, triggered first by international developments, the normalization of US interest rates, the high oil prices, the strength of the dollar. These were factors which meant that there was an outflow of money from all emerging markets and lots of regional currencies, particularly countries with a current account deficit, which experience pressure on their exchange rate. But then, subsequently, some domestic factors also kicked in. The trade balance deteriorated sharply, and there were three causal factors. One was gold, and that was because we reduced the tariff on gold to zero. India had a tariff of 15%. People imported gold duty-free into Sri Lanka and smuggled to India, and there was a massive increase in our gold imports. But now that tariff has been adjusted, there is no arbitrage opportunity between Sri Lanka and India, and gold imports have come down. So that source of pressure has been removed. Second, motor vehicles, again, duty reductions, particularly on small vehicles, led to a sharp increase, about 133% increase in the first 9-10 months in the imports of motor vehicles. That again has been addressed through a duty adjustment plus import margins, some macroprudential measures that have been, some margins that have been placed on LCs as a macroprudential measure. And in November we saw, with a lag, the motor vehicle imports are coming down. So the domestic pressures on the exchanges have been removed. And also internationally, there is money beginning to flow back to emerging markets. Countries like India, Indonesia, which had pressure on their exchange rate, are now actually getting money flowing in. We didn't experience that because that switch took place when we were in the middle of our political difficulties. So we have not really seen that turnaround yet. But hopefully, going by the last week or so, the worst is over, because we've addressed the sources of internal pressure in the current account of the balance of payments. A lot of the pressure was coming from capital outflows, from outflows of investments, foreign investment in government securities, and hopefully that will tail off as you know, the pressure on the external account gets less, and the international environment also becomes less unfavorable to emerging economies. And certainly since the Honorable Finance Minister's photograph appeared with a smiling managing director of the IMF, things have got more stable. So hopefully that will continue. Then on fiscal policy, I'll be very quick. Last year, we're not going to hit the targets. Revenue is less than expected, but the expenditure also was less than expected, and therefore, hopefully, we won't go too far outside the target. So these are, you know, some of the challenges that we have. We really, as I said, need to press on with fiscal consolidation. If we lose discipline, we have very little room to maneuver, very little room to maneuver. And because invariably, if excess demand is created in the system through loose fiscal policy or through loose monetary policy, we have seen it again and again, it leaks into imports, it creates pressure on our reserves and exchange rate, and we're on a really thin margin, and we can't afford to do that. So discipline has to be maintained. And it always pains me when people, everybody, even knowledgeable people from the economics profession say, well, this is an election year, so they'll have to spend. No, they can't spend. There is no money to spend, you know. We don't, I think that whole mindset has to change, whereby we make excuses and say, well, this is the political cycle. That would have been fine if we'd managed our affairs better. We have managed our affairs so badly that really I mean, there can be a little bit of space, but we really need to keep run a very tight ship if we don't want to have a major crash. And it's the economic profession that has to make this case. Please, if you don't, I mean, I'm not saying you have to believe all I'm saying, but I would like you to look at the data, look at the prospects for the country, and look at the space we have for any kind of loose behavior before an election or anything else. And if you think that it should be, the highest priority should be given to maintaining discipline, then I would implore you to make that known as loudly and as clearly as you can. Quickly on the theme, my colleagues in the Economic Research Department have given me some very good material. I'm grateful to them. I'll very quickly run through it. The popular economist Joseph Stiglitz describes globalization in his book, Making Globalization Work. And in his definition, globalization encompasses many things: the international flow of ideas and knowledge, the sharing of cultures, global civil society, and the global environment movement. The great hope of globalization is that it will raise living standards throughout the world, give poor countries access to overseas markets so that they can sell their goods, allow in foreign investment that will make new products at cheaper prices, and open borders so that people can travel abroad to be educated, work, and send home earnings to help their families and fund new businesses. That's Stiglitz on globalization. Now, over the past several decades, the world economy has witnessed a rapid pace of integration. On the surface, globalization entails several benefits as global markets offer greater opportunity for people to tap into numerous markets of larger sizes around the world. Hence, this improves access to capital flows, technology, cheaper imports, and larger export markets. Numerous countries have opened up their economies and have experienced an unprecedented rise in the flow of goods and capital across borders. This process of economic globalization has been coincident with rising living standards in several countries, particularly in Asia. In the case of developing countries, the integration of their economies with the rest of the world has led to episodes of strong economic growth and substantial poverty. I must say, globalization, which was given a boost after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Just after that, I think maybe 1990-91, at that time I was working in London, and I saw that Professor Meghnad Desai, who was a well-known left economist, was giving a talk on globalization. So I went there expecting him to tear this concept down as a new neo-imperialist movement that was there to exploit the developing world. So I went and listened to him and I was utterly shocked, because he said, now this is our chance, because international capital doesn't look at creed, caste, anything. It just wants to make profits. And we have a competitive advantage. And money will come to the developing world and there will be a transformation in the global center of economic gravity. And sure enough, he's been absolutely right. And in the last 20, 25 years, we've seen that happen. And so when we look at globalization, clearly there are benefits, but as in the case with all economic phenomena, globalization too has two sides to the coin. The current process of globalization has been accused to have generated unbalanced outcomes, both between and within countries, thereby leading to rich countries with poor people. It has been said that globalization has not met the simple and legitimate aspirations for decent jobs and a better future for the next generation, leaving the vast majority of women and men in the limbo of the informal economy without formal rights, and a swathe of poor countries that subsist precariously on the margins of the global economy. Now, while that is also true, and that's if you can look at countries where this can be seen, but the East Asians have been very successful in making globalization work for them. Globalization has provided access to international markets and access to technology that enabled vast rises in productivity, which in turn helped millions in East Asia out of poverty. Another notable aspect was the ability of these countries to take advantage of globalization without being taken advantage of by globalization itself. A key lesson from the East Asian experience was the ability of the governments to ensure that the benefits of growth were widely shared. In addition to their focus on building hard and soft infrastructure, these governments played a large role in planning and advancing the adoption and adaptation of technology, as well as choosing the sectors which their countries could develop, rather than entirely allowing markets to determine this. But one must say that these governments did not intend to outsmart the market by picking winners over market choices. But they did realize that often markets fail to properly coordinate new activities in which there were enormous spillover benefits. And this is what they really were focused on, really making sure that these spillover benefits were taken advantage of. And they had the administrative capacity to intervene in the economy without dragging the whole thing down. But having said that, we now have to recognize that some of the industrial policy choices that were available in East Asia at that time are no longer WTO compliant. So they're not available to us today. So that, one needs to be cautious when one is looking at the East Asian story and drawing lessons from the East Asian story. The global trade rules have changed since those countries had their big boost to trade. So that has to be taken into account as well. These countries also ensured that foreign investment entailed a transfer of technology and training of local workers. For example, Malaysia worked with foreign oil companies to develop their domestic petroleum resources, learning in the process. Today, Petronas provides training for other developing countries. A little bit about the middle income trap, which we've also heard about from previous speakers. The term middle income trap has been used to capture the fact that over the past half-century, very few middle-income countries have become high-income industrial nations. The term middle-income trap captures a situation where a middle-income country can no longer compete internationally in standardized labor-intensive commodities because wages are too high, but it can also not compete in higher value-added activities on a broad enough scale because the productivity is too low. The result is slow growth and less potential for raising living standards. A descriptive analysis of the differences in the fundamentals of SKPs at countries which have actually graduated, as well as non-SKPs, show that the SKPs have higher GDP and, importantly, total factor productivity at all relative income levels. Further, they have greater levels of human capital, investment in infrastructure, faster industrialization, and a consistently export-oriented policy stance. Above all, they have had better macroeconomic management. Now, turning to capital flows, in recent times it has been noted that global financial cycles and capital flows tend to amplify business cycles in emerging economies, encompassing significant policy challenges. In turn, empirical evidence suggests that strong macroeconomic fundamentals tend to safeguard economies from sudden changes in global finance and financial conditions. Although economies such as Sri Lanka have adopted a more heterodox policy toolkit, as Professor Abhiratna pointed out, comprising monetary, macroprudential, fiscal and exchange rate policies and some capital controls, the implementation of such policies entails significant trade-offs, and we have not always handled those trade-offs very well. In fact, the stronger interconnectedness with global financial markets resulting from globalization has increased the premium attached to sound economic management. Globalization places a very high premium on competitiveness. And if you are not lean and mean and you're not able to compete, clearly you're going to be left behind. The professor has spoken at some length about global production sharing, so I won't really say much about it. But that is one of the big missing pieces in our development story. In the last couple of decades, I guess, intra-firm trade in Asia, that is basically supply chains, has been the most dynamic component of the international trading system. And we have a negligible presence. So we've missed a massive opportunity. Part of it is because, there are a number of reasons, but one thing has been the increase in para-tariffs. Our protection has increased significantly. in the last 10, 15 years. Mainly, the tariff levels are okay. I mean, a lot of them are WTO determined. But the para-tariffs increase significantly. And what that para-tariffs basically push you out of the global value chains. Because in modern production, in the cross-border production sharing networks, the distinction between imports and exports gets blurred. You bring stuff in, you do your little bit, and send it out. Now, if you put a para-tariff in the middle of that, you're out. You're not competitive, and you don't get into you don't penetrate those value chains, which is what has happened to us. So the government has started to eliminate those para-tariffs. It needs to press on, but of course there are revenue implications, but there needs to be a balanced approach to reducing para-tariffs. We are late in the day, so let me just move on here. The other thing is services. Considering the large pool of literate and educated, I mean, the template for manufacturing supply chains is, I think, our apparel industry. I mean, they've been extremely good in terms of going up the value chain. Even after the loss of the quotas which came with the multi-fiber agreement, after the loss of GSP, despite all that, they were able to reposition in themselves. They went up the value chain, they got into design, they got into branding. That really is a template for a successful export industry. So that's for manufacturing. Considering the large pool of literate and educated service sector professionals that Sri Lanka has, we must also proactively investigate value chains, global value chains in the services sector. The services sector has been referred to as the glue that holds supply chains together and ensures that they function in a fluid manner due to the innumerable services that are required for the production and sale of products, irrespective of whether they are goods or services. The steady rise in the share of services value added in the world domestic product to 65% in 2016 from 53% shows that services are becoming an increasingly important part of global value chains. Although services were conventionally viewed as enablers of GVCs, today they are becoming increasingly disaggregated and traded as separate tasks. The archetypal examples are back office and data processing services. As Sri Lanka has already successfully engaged in such service chains, the next step should be to engage in higher value-added tasks in service value chains such as design, R&D, innovation, and marketing and branding. Therefore, Sri Lanka should focus on economic upgrading or climbing the value chain, climbing the value-added ladder by improving current processes, increasing the services content of domestic value-added in exports, and also by diversifying into activities that can involve more sophisticated production processes. Now, another thing is the export complexity. I think Ricardo Hausmann and others have emphasized the importance of this. If you look at a map of export complexity between Thailand and Sri Lanka in the mid-80s, say 1985 or so, and you look at it now, it's incredible how much greater complexity there is in Thailand and how far behind we are when it comes to export complexity. So in conclusion, globalization entails a significant opening up of the economy across various sectors human capital, foreign investment, trade, and even the financial sector. We have seen in recent years that change entails uncertainties which will have to be embraced if the country is to reap the benefits of a rapidly evolving global economy. So let me finish by saying what we really need to do is to go back to our roots. For millennia, Sri Lanka was a hub in the middle of the Indian Ocean. We have found both Roman as well as Chinese coins in our architectural sites, which reinforces the fact that this is what we were. We were open, we were out in the middle of the Indian Ocean, we were a hub, and we were a great trading center. We need to go back there. So we need to take advantage of the locational advantages we still have. We are slap bang in the middle of China's maritime Silk Route. We are 20 miles from the fastest growing large economy in the world. We have good access to the Middle East, to East Africa. We are equidistant between Europe and the Far East. We have all these advantages together. And so we need to bring that together and really take advantage, really, of greater integration. Does integration work or not? I have one test, which I keep telling people. I just look at China. You look at the coastal regions of China, you look at the hinterland of China. It is night and day, the difference in terms of development. The coastal regions are very integrated to the global economy. The hinterland is not. And if you look at the difference between the two, that I think would make the case as strongly as possible for the benefits of globalization, provided it's done prudently. And finally, an optimistic note. My former colleague, Dr. P.B. Jayasundar said, the feel-good factor in this economy is based on just two things. One is rainfall and two is oil prices. The reservoirs are full and oil prices are not too bad. So hopefully going forward, this is going to be a good year. Thank you very much.